Welcome, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. You do? Perfect. So, welcome, dear distinguished speakers over here, dear members of the Hertie community, dear guests. My name is Violeta Moreno-Lax. I am ICREA Research Chair at the University of Barcelona, Professor of Law at Queen Mary University of London, and a visiting professor here at the Hertie Center for Fundamental Rights, which is co-hosting the event this evening, together with Bard College Berlin, from which we're going to be hearing in a second. So on behalf of the center, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening discussion with Kenneth Roth and a panel of experts with backgrounds in human rights law, climate and anti-war activism, and international media, whom I will introduce later on. The discussion will offer us an opportunity to jointly reflect on the current state of human rights globally today, and this is a very much needed reflection indeed. The field of human rights has always been contested and dynamic, but the need for dialogue and informed reflection feels especially urgent today. While the past few decades has seen human rights advocacy gain global traction, visibility, and influence, with human rights discourse becoming a central part of international legitimacy, we are now confronted with a markedly hostile environment. Long-standing challenges have intensified and now intersect with a range of emerging threats. The accelerating climate crisis, the global rise of authoritarianism, the decline of the rules-based order, and increasing challenges to multilateral efforts at conflict resolution, all of which we're going to be discussing today. At the same time, we're witnessing a transformation of the tools and the strategies available to human rights actors. Digital technologies that have revolutionized fact-finding and communication have also introduced new vulnerabilities and new challenges to human rights advocacy, ranging from disinformation to surveillance, steered shifts in public opinion shaped by social media, filter bubbles, and widespread untruths and misinformation. So against this backdrop, I'm very much looking forward to tonight's discussion on these elements. Thank you very much, Kimberly, and thank you very much, Fred, for this overview of the work that you are conducting at the Bard College. We're very excited at the opportunities that are opening in front of us for future collaboration. I'll use 1 minute to just summarize that we're a complement to the Bard College in the space of fundamental rights. The Hertie School Center for Fundamental Rights concentrates on research mostly. We're a postgraduate school, so we train the next generation of researchers and policymakers. So the research concentrates on pressing issues around topics which are complementary to those that Fred just introduced. We also address human rights and technology. Not only, we also look at authoritarianism, the climate crisis, migration, and the role of institutions, including courts, in addressing the key challenges of facing human rights today. And as part of a School of Public Policy, it couldn't be otherwise. Our mission extends beyond the research and teaching to include active public engagement as with events like this evening to inform public opinion and to hopefully strive to foster meaningful dialogue across academic, policy, and civil society communities. And tonight, coming back to Ken and the panel, we're honored to be joined by you, Ken, the leader of Human Rights Watch for nearly 3 decades, who played a pivotal role in shaping not only Human Rights Watch, but the global human rights movement as a whole. Under your leadership, Human Rights Watch expanded to become the major actor that it is today, leading on chief global initiatives. For those who might not know immediately, these include co-funding the international campaign to ban landmines, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997, but not only this, also advocating for the creation of the International Criminal Court that is partly in doubt, in question today, and we're also going to be discussing about this. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ken to the Hertie School, and I'm pleased to welcome also our distinguished panel. Catherine Sutman is an experienced journalist and war reporter. She's sitting over here. I'm going to be calling you progressively to the podium. She is a war reporter for many years, as I said, reporting from the Middle East, and now managing partner at Cobalt Documentary. She's going to be joined by Wolfgang Kalek, which is the founder and general secretary of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, and also, last but not least, Arshak Makichian, which is a climate and anti-war activist and currently pursuing a master's degree here at the Hertie School. So please, Ken, Catherine, Wolfgang, and Arshak, join me on stage. So our conversation today, as we've been already saying a few times, is titled Looking Back and Looking Ahead, and we're holding this event on the occasion of Ken's recently published book, Righting Wrongs. You see a copy there. We're going to be reflecting on nearly 3 decades of the work that Ken has conducted, which the book traces, and it traces it from the beginnings of Human Rights Watch, tracing the evolution of the organization from a very small, or roughly small, monitoring group into the global influential player that is become, covering over 100 countries around the globe and engaging with some of the most complex and politically charged human rights crises of our time. So at the heart of the book is a reflection on the strategies and the methods that have shaped Human Rights Watch work and the human rights movement globally, based on rigorous, fact-based investigations grounded in international human rights standards, and the strategic use of public pressure by shaming those who commit human rights violations, mobilizing international attention, rallying support, and pushing for accountability. So in our discussion today, we will be engaging with these themes by reflecting on what we can learn from past writings of wrongs. And at the same time, we would also like to critically reflect on the methods and the strategies employed by Human Rights Watch in a context where not only is fact-finding becoming more difficult, more inaccessible, more dangerous, but where facts themselves seem to matter less in public discourse, typically hijacked by ideological responses that tend to overshadow evidence. We will also address the broader decline of the international rules-based order and the global trend in which leaders, not only in autocracies, but growingly also in democracies, appear immune to shaming. And finally, we also want to look ahead and to consider the future of the human rights movement by engaging with the perspectives and priorities of a new generation of activists. So without further ado, I now give the floor to the first panelist who's going to start the conversation. I'll be keeping the time, I'm moderating. But please, Catherine, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay, good. Thank you very much for hosting us. And thank you, Ken, for your book and for being here. And I wanted to, I wanted to ask you something that at the very end of your book, you reflect on the challenges ahead. And it's a little weird, but I'm going to start with that because, as a lot of the speakers mentioned already, the world is not in a good state. We have democracies in decline. We have autocracies on the rise. And I read in a review on your book in Foreign Policy, they titled this review, "Is there a future for human rights?" And that's the first question I wanted to ask you.
Okay, well, Katrin, that's a big question. Let me answer it in 2 parts. One is that, the bulk of the book, what I really tried to accomplish with the book is that, when I would tell people, I defend human rights, you kind of get this glazed look in their eyes. And people say, well, that's nice. but, you can't get anything done, can you? And so the bulk of the book is to show how you can get things done. And what I did is I deliberately took on the toughest cases. So I deal with China, I deal with Russia, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Rwanda, the United States. And in each of these cases, I show the way we were able to arm twist governments to behave better. We start from the premise that violating human rights is convenient. If you're a government, it's a way to stay in power. It's a way to get rid of the pesky opposition. And so if we can change the cost-benefit analysis of repression, if we can make it less beneficial, more costly, we can force governments to act better. And so the bulk of the book is running through kind of illustrations of the strategies we use. And they're not rocket science. We start from the premise that in today's world, every government has to pretend that it respects human rights. That's a key part of its legitimacy. It's a way of saying, we serve you, the public, not just ourselves. When Human Rights Watch was able to send investigators into the field and document this discrepancy between the haughty pretenses and the ugly reality, it was embarrassing. It was shameful. It was delegitimizing. And governments would go to great lengths to try to counter that spotlight. It was a very intense spotlight we could shine. And they would try to spin and say we misunderstood and we lied and we were deceived and we're biased, the usual things. But we were actually accurate. We were very careful. And ultimately, they realized that they couldn't use PR techniques to get rid of the bad press. The only way to get rid of the bad press is to change the bad conduct. And so that was a very important tool. The other thing we do, which is often less appreciated, is that we would go to influential governments that purport to promote human rights in their foreign policy. And Germany was a big example of that. We regularly go to the German government. And we would ask them to figure out what does the target government want. And they always want something. They want an arms deal. They want trade subsidies, whatever it is. Deprive them of that. Say they can't get it until they change. And so that puts very severe economic and diplomatic pressure on governments. And then in extreme cases, we try to get them prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, universal jurisdiction, which Wolfgang knows very well, and nobody wants to go to jail. So those are the sorts of tools we use. The specifics completely vary from country to country. You've got to tailor it. But what I show is it often works. It doesn't always work. If it works today, it doesn't mean it's going to still work tomorrow. It's a perpetual need for pressure. But in even big cases, we can make a big difference and save lives. So in terms of, is tomorrow going to be different from today? No. These techniques still work. Now, Katrin, the other big part of your question is, and you stated, is democracy declining? Are we in the age of autocracy? And, sitting in the West, sitting in an established democracy, it's actually easy to feel that because in many established democracies, they are not doing a good job of serving basically, the working class of their country. There are people who feel left behind. They're economically stagnating. They're facing growing inequality. They feel that the government is like a bunch of distant experts who don't listen to them. They don't respect them. They don't serve them. And in that context of neglect, these people are ripe for the appeal of the autocrat. This is the AfD constituency in Germany. This is Trump. This is Marine Le Pen. And so in the West, there's no question that there's work that we have to do to improve how democracy delivers to everybody. Not just to the people who live in cities like Berlin, but to people who, are working class who may not be doing so well right now. But the picture is actually very different if you look at the rest of the world. And from the perspective, particularly of people who live under autocrats, the vision from the perspective of those autocrats is pretty grim because people want out from under autocracy. And the evidence of that is these huge protests that we have seen in country after country after country of people trying to oust the autocrat, people seeking democracy. And sometimes these protests work. I mean, if you just look in the last few years, we got rid of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. We got rid of the Rajapaksa dynasty in Sri Lanka. The Law and Justice Party in Poland was ousted. Bolsonaro in Brazil, gone. South Korea, a presidential coup attempt was blocked. So these are examples of, popular mobilization for democracy that worked. We have certain situations today where there's a work in progress, Serbia, Turkey. It's not clear how that's going to come out. And then we have countries where they were so repressive that they, for the time being, they suppressed the pro-democracy protests. So, Hong Kong, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Nicaragua, Uganda. So it doesn't always work. But these countries that have resorted to repression essentially have given up on trying to pretend that there is popular consent to their rule. They're hanging on by the barrel of the gun. And that is difficult to do for the long time. Ask Bashar al-Assad, the former Syrian president, who now had to flee to Moscow. So I actually think when you take a global perspective, what becomes clear is that people want democracy. Democracy as a value, as a vision, is not in decline. It's a struggle. We shouldn't be surprised at that because, yes, there are autocrats that don't like democracy. That's who they are by definition. But I think that the balance between autocracy and democracy is very different if you take a global perspective versus if you just sit in the United States or Europe and consider the trends in our part of the world.
But at the same time, I mean, things have changed tremendously in the last couple of years. And you could argue, what Human Rights Watch did, like investigate, expose, change, or shaming, as you call it. If governments don't care about their global reputation anymore, what leverage do you have with shaming them?
Well,
and what can you actually change?
No, I mean, if they didn't care, it's true, we would have less leverage, but they do care. And, one of the examples I outline in quite a bit of detail in the book is China. If there's ever a powerful government that you would think would be above being shamed, it would be China. But the problem that Xi Jinping has is if you ask Xi Jinping, why are you president of China? He can't say, well, there's a free and fair election and I represent the popular will of the Chinese people. He's to say, no, the Chinese people want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party because we've made them richer. That's basically his argument. And, sounds good, except for that minor problem that the only part of China where people had any opportunity to express themselves was Hong Kong, where hundreds of thousands of people took to the street and said, no, we don't want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why Xi Jinping crushed Hong Kong's freedoms. When we, given that lack of domestic legitimacy through traditional means, China cares enormously about what other governments say about it. It cares about its reputation. And you see this in, the remarkable efforts that Beijing makes to silence criticism abroad, denying companies access to their market, transnational repression, threatening a Chinese dissident's family back in the mainland China if they're criticizing them from Berlin. So they're super sensitive. When Human Rights Watch tried to put China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council in October 2022, an effort that we lost by 2 votes. So it was very, very close. Xi Jinping himself was on the phone calling heads of state, pushing them to vote with China. You do not get the president of this massive country lobbying other governments about, the potential reputational damage at the UN if they didn't care about that reputation. So I, take heart from that. I think that, even China cares. Now, it is true that, there's some countries like Putin where, in a sense, I tell a story.
Turkey, Erdogan.
Well, Erdogan, what happens at a certain point when they get desperate, Erdogan realized that he was about to lose the next election. So he locks up the mayor of Istanbul, his chief competitor. But, he's also, and he has other cards in his hand because he's key to Ukraine, he's now key to Syria. So he's playing that for all he can, but he's also trying to maintain good relations with Europe. And of course, this is where, the stance of Europe matters. Because if Europe says, oh, we just need him, he's too important strategically, we're going to ignore the fact that autocracy is emerging, then it's easier for Erdogan to do this. But it is, so, the ability to put pressure on someone does really depend on governments being willing to stand up for principle. And Turkey is one of those countries where you never quite know where the West stands. Sometimes they're playing with Erdogan, sometimes they're trying to push him to do the right thing. And so, that's a challenge, I think, that is more won in Western capitals than it is simply in Ankara.
Thank you for that. I'm going to give the floor now to Wolfgang, because it's true that shaming might be working in certain respects, vis-a-vis certain countries and in terms of certain issues. But I wonder what Wolfgang would have to say in relation to the rules-based international order, the ICC, and perhaps Germany. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. There is this notion of the world is now in disorder and the decline of the international legal order, and I would like to question this notion. Was the world ever in order, or was it only in order for us, who profited from the state of world throughout the last decades? And when we talk about the decline of international law, international human rights law, when did it begin? In 1948, when the UK and France didn't allow the convenience of civil and political rights and social and economic rights to get enforced because they had to fight the colonial wars? Was it in order when the US backed the dictatorships in Central America or in South America, Chile and Argentina? And people are now talking about Trump, but both of us, we were very involved 20 years ago with the invasion of Iraq and especially with the systematic torture. So did the decline of legal order begin now in January? Or was it, as you just said, for democracy, wasn't it always a struggle for human rights with backlashes, but also with progress?
Wolfgang, completely the latter. And that's a point that I make in the book is that you can never, if you're a human rights defender, you can never just declare victory and go home. The defense of human rights is a perpetual struggle. And you win some, but then there can be backsliding. I think a good example is a story I tell in the book about Rwanda's invasion of Eastern Congo. And this, Rwanda's tool is a rebel group known as the M23, which essentially is an extension of the Rwandan government. They retained its autonomous. And back in 2010, 2011, 2012, Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, invaded Eastern Congo using the M23 because there's a lot of mineral deposits in Eastern Congo that are very lucrative, and he wanted that money. So Human Rights Watch has an office in Goma, the principal city of Eastern Congo, and we put out a report showing that Rwanda was militarily backing the M23. And Paul Kagame said, no, we're not. He lied. So, a few months later, we put out another report showing that Rwanda was still backing the M23, and Paul Kagame said, no, I'm not. It took 3 reports. It took the 3rd report before finally everybody understood that we were telling the truth and Kagame was lying through his teeth. At which point, we were able to get John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, and William Hague, the British Foreign Secretary, to call Kagame and say, if you don't stop backing the M23, you're going to lose your international assistance. And I have never seen a rebel group crumble so quickly. It was days, and it was gone. And so for 8 years, the people of Eastern Congo were not being preyed upon by this awful rebel group. But Wolfgang, to come to your point, you can't go home and say, done, because Paul Kagame spent those 8 years trying to make himself better able to defend against Western pressure. And then he sent the M23 back in. And so now the M23 is once again has occupied Eastern Congo. And Kagame has put peacekeepers into northern Mozambique and Central African Republic. He has created a conference center in Kigali and has people come and visit him all the time. He sponsors Arsenal and Paris Saint-Germain. So people who watch football games visit Rwanda on the jerseys of their favorite football players. He does all these things to try to make himself have a better image, to try to resist this pressure. And then the West is part of the problem too. The European Union entered into a mineral deal with Rwanda to purchase minerals that Rwanda doesn't have. Where do you think those are coming from? Trump just oversaw a ceasefire deal and says, now I want to have a minerals deal with both sides. Congo, fair enough, but with Rwanda? So we now have a West that is more interested in its economic self-interest than in the idea of defending borders. And, it's tough to say Russia should pull out of eastern Ukraine, but Rwanda can stay in eastern Congo. But that's where we are right now. And of course, it's more difficult when Trump is going to take, Greenland or turn Canada into the 51st state. So this is, part of, Wolfgang, what you're referring to is, there is a lack of respect for some basic rules here among key actors that is part of the problem. But I'm persuaded that coming back to Eastern Congo, we can build pressure on Kagame to pull out. It's a matter of and there's been, condemnation, there's been a gradual reduction of aid, but, the screws haven't been tightened the way they were in 2012, and that's what we have to get to happen. If the West will react the same way, Kagame will pull out.
That was Congo and Rwanda. What about The Hague and New York? I mean, the US cut important support for UN agencies, for the UN itself, and of course, put into force new sanctions against the ICC in The Hague, which are, let's say, at least alarming, but might put the existence of the court in question, together with the sanction systems, the combination of sanctions against the ICC and the sanctions they are trying to establish in Israel, listing Palestine organization, but also listing probably Israeli organization, drying them out. So new NGO legislation. Isn't that a new threat for the global legal order? Because important institutions are dried out, and also civil society organizations who were at least one of the motors of the progress of international law throughout the last decades?
I mean, in terms of the U.S. cuts to USAID or to NGOs, there's no question that hurts. Human Rights Watch, we deliberately built Human Rights Watch so it takes no government money. So it didn't affect us directly, but it does affect many of our colleague organizations who, if you're an organization in Zimbabwe or whatever, you can't, go to local business people to pay for you because they would face retaliation. You need to go to Western governments, and the U.S. was the biggest donor among them, is now gone. So there's no question that is harmful. What Trump has done with the International Criminal Court, and which is to say he's imposed sanctions on the chief prosecutor, basically frozen his bank accounts and blocked his travel because he had the audacity to charge Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant for their starvation strategy, their war crime starvation strategy in Gaza. So that is outrageous. We shouldn't pretend that that's normalized. It actually is a straightforward crime. If you read Article 70 of the Rome Treaty, the guiding statute for the International Criminal Court, it criminalizes any effort to threaten or intimidate a judicial personnel because of their official functions. So what Trump did is that crime. Now, Karim Khan is just temporarily set aside because of sexual assault allegations. So the ICC is a bit headless right now. I'm not sure that the deputies are going to have the strength to charge Trump, but he's vulnerable to being charged. In terms of kind of the broader Trump assaults on the international system to defend rights, we shouldn't get too despairing here, because this is not the first time this has happened. And I actually have a piece coming out on The Guardian on Sunday where I elaborate on this a bit, and I talk about it all in the book. But if you look at Trump's first term, where he similarly just, he actually left the UN Human Rights Council. Here he's just saying, I won't cooperate with it anymore, but Biden already did him the favor of not running for re-election. So the US is not a member. But the last time, we got a lot done without the United States, or sometimes despite the United States. So to give an example, we were able to condemn Maduro in Venezuela. We got the UN Human Rights Council to set up an investigative body and condemn what he was doing. I would say because Trump was not involved. If Trump had been involved, Maduro would have dismissed it as Yankee imperialism. But because it was led by a group of Latin American democracies plus Canada, it was seen as a principled endeavor, and we won. Another example was we got the UN Human Rights Council in an effort led by the Netherlands to create a body to investigate and report on the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of civilians in Yemen. Here, the US was opposed, Britain was opposed, we won. And again, it was because we put together a coalition of governments that could stand up to Washington. And it wasn't just Trump. I mean, I think, we shouldn't think that it's only Trump who has this, human rights double standard coming out of Washington. It was the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration that opposed our efforts to ban anti-personnel landmines. It was the Clinton administration that opposed the idea of an international criminal court unless we could guarantee that an American would never be prosecuted, which of course we said, forget that, And in those cases, what we did is we put together a coalition of 60 governments, with Germany playing an instrumental role. These were medium and small democracies from around the world that together had the moral and the political clout to resist not only Washington, but also Beijing and Moscow and Delhi. They were all against us. And we won. We got a landmines treaty. We got an international criminal court. And so the lesson that I draw from that is, don't just think it's all about the superpower. The superpower is often in the wrong place. And if we can put together coalitions, we can prevail in these situations, and we can ensure that there is still a strong defense of human rights. We've shown this historically, and we can show it again today. It does mean that Europe has to move beyond just worrying about reinforcing NATO or just worrying about surviving Trump's arbitrary tariffs. It's got to keep its eye on the human rights ball. But if it does, it can still prevail.
Thank you for that. I need to move to Ashak now. I know Wolfgang has more questions.
No, it was just a word on Germany, Germany's role. You mentioned that it was crucial in the past, but where is it now?
Well, I mean,
especially in the question of Gaza and the arrest
No,
warrant against
and
Netanyahu.
Wolfgang, I'm glad you bring that up, because what Merz has said, which is, if first, let's take a step backwards. As an ICC member, the 125 members of the International Criminal Court have an obligation to arrest anybody against whom an arrest warrant has been issued. So, which would mean that if Netanyahu shows up here in Berlin, Germany has an obligation to arrest him. And Merz, the new chancellor, has said, maybe I wouldn't. That is horrible. It is particularly bad coming from Germany because Germany did, as I say, play such an instrumental role in creating the ICC. Germany was one of the most powerful governments we looked to resist the Clinton administration's idea that it was justice for everybody else but not Americans. And so to go from this very principled original German contribution to the ICC to Merz creating an Israel exception to the ICC is a huge step backwards. And we all know where it comes from. It comes from this Staatsräson, the view that Germany has to make amends for the Holocaust. And yes, Germany should make amends for the Holocaust. The way to do that is to say, not how do we defend Israel, regardless of what it does. The way to do it is to say, how do you defend Jews? And the way you defend Jews is by having strong human rights standards that protect Jews and everybody else. But if you say, no, we're just going to protect Israel, regardless of what it does, regardless of how it rips up the Geneva Conventions, You can't have, a Palestinian exception to human rights today and pretend that Jews are going to be safe tomorrow and somebody else is going to be safe the third day. So this is, the wrong lesson from the Holocaust. And there is a real need for the German government to re-examine how it is interpreting its Staatsräson.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And building on the point that the human rights system needs to cover everyone, I wonder what Arshak would have to ask you in terms of whether it covers or doesn't cover all of the activists that it should. So please, Arshak.
Thank you. My question is about continuity of some human rights violations, and the genocide in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh happened in 2023, and then next year Azerbaijan was hosting COP29, and I was organizing a campaign around COP29 against greenwashing of genocide, and I was following very closely what major human rights organizations were saying and doing about it, and majority of human rights organizations have decided to stay silent. I've read Human Rights Watch report on human rights violations in Azerbaijan, 80 pages, not a single word about looting of Armenian houses, destruction of cultural heritage, and the genocide itself. And also Amnesty and all other major human rights organizations. And I'm asking this question as an Armenian. My great-grandma survived the genocide. She fled from Western Armenia, which is till today occupied by Turkey, and we are prohibited of owning lands in our own indigenous lands. And then my grandparents from my mother's side are from Nakhichevan Republic. During Soviet occupation times, all Armenians have been deported, all indigenous Armenians. Armenian population from 50% went to 0. And I have never visited Nakhichevan. I am prohibited of visiting Nakhichevan. And now the same history repeated itself in Artsakh. And there was this person in Germany, he asked this question, who remembers Armenians? And my question to you is whether human rights organizations, Western human rights organizations, remember Armenians?
Okay, well, I think everybody remembers the original Armenian genocide that the Turks committed. So I don't think there's much question about that. Your question on Nagorno-Karabakh, I have not used the term genocide to refer to what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm happy to look at the evidence, but I think it was an example of, massive forced displacement. It clearly was a huge war crime, probably a crime against humanity. I don't lightly use the term genocide, so I'm not sure it's applicable to Nagorno-Karabakh, but that doesn't diminish the fact that, people were pushed from their homes and right now have zero prospect of returning. And in the meantime, everybody just closes their eyes to the Aliyev's government's, very autocratic, repressive rule because they're looking for alternatives to Russian gas, and Azerbaijan provides that. And, so this is just, a trade-off in which Europe is downgrading respect for human rights because of its, economic concerns. So I think we should, not get too lost on the rhetoric and look instead at the very troubling Western reaction to what did happen in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue about terminology, but Armenians cannot return to Western Armenia.
Which is wrong, which is absolutely wrong, yes.
Human rights organizations, they continue to stay silent because it happened in 2023 and then it was forgotten the next day.
Okay.
It continues.
I have the luxury, I suppose, of no longer being responsible for Human Rights Watch. So, so I left in August 2022, and so I can't speak to what they have or haven't said. I generally think they do an excellent job. But if you ask me in principle, should people forcibly displaced from their homes, whether it's in Nakhichevan or Nagorno-Karabakh, should they be able to return home? Absolutely. That's just a basic fact of human rights law. It's an antidote to forced displacement.
Yeah, and my second question was about marginalization of activists, which is happening also in Europe. I was part of Fridays for Future movement, and Greta Thunberg was declared an anti-Semite in Germany, and the same basically happened before in Russia. All climate activists and human rights activists have been declared foreign agents, extremists and whatever. And we see the same trends in Europe. climate movement is prosecuted also in Germany, in the UK, and it's very kind of scary. And then I feel that also human rights organizations, they decide to stay silent about these issues when like climate activists who are on the front lines of fighting against this kind of authoritarianism trends also in Europe are choosing to stay silent.
I mean, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, Human Rights Watch has a program on the environment and human rights, and a big part of what they do is defend environmental activists who are being persecuted. So, I mean, I can't speak to every single case, but as a rule, that's a big part of what they try to do. Now, to put this in a slightly broader context, I think we have to recognize, what the autocrats' playbook says. And this is, a metaphoric playbook. It's not, a real one. But they all follow the same pattern, which is they try to undermine the checks and balances on their authority. And part of that is neutralizing the legislature, and part is neutralizing judges, and part is silencing journalists. A big part is snuffing out civil society. And which is why it is so important to recognize that a vigorous civil society is a critical antidote to autocracy. And I think that that is deeply understood by the human rights movement, which is why there is so much pushback when Russia tries to use the foreign agents law, or whatever the ploy of the moment is, and it varies from country to country. But the pretextual effort to silence civil society because they are a way of organizing to promote the truth and to hold the autocrat accountable and to press for the rule of law being applied to the executive branch, that's a very important battle, and I think people fully understand that.
Yeah, I'm asking because we are in Hertie School, and sometimes when I attend some lectures, I feel that students are afraid to ask questions about Gaza and some other issues, and we are in a political science university, and that's the case. We are in Europe, and people are afraid even to ask a question.
Well, I mean, this is a separate thing. I realize that to talk about Gaza, to criticize Israel in Germany is very difficult for people because you get charged with being an anti-Semite. And, we should unpack that for a moment because, anti-Semitism is a real problem. And it's been a more acute problem since the big-time fighting began on October 7th, 2023. And so, it is something that Jews around the world, including in Germany, are plagued by. If people begin to think that charges of anti-Semitism are just a way to silence criticism of Israel, that cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism at a point where we actually need a real defense against anti-Semitism. And so when that happens, if somebody says, this person criticized Israel, they're an anti-Semite, the answer to that is, no, you are endangering Jews. You, by cheapening this concept of anti-Semitism, by equating it with legitimate criticism of Israel, are making life more dangerous for Jews. Because the mere fact of protecting Israel from criticism for its human rights violations does nothing for Jews who live in Germany or France or Britain or the United States who are facing the threat of anti-Semitism, but that threat won't be taken as seriously if the term becomes a cheap excuse to stop criticism of Israel.
Thank you very much. I think we need to open the floor now because there isn't a lot of time left, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to take the opportunity to ask you questions, Ken. So we are open to your questions. Raise your hand, and there will be a microphone coming your way promptly. We'll take perhaps 2, 3 in one go.
We'll just do one at a time.
One at a time? Okay, so please introduce yourselves, put your question succinctly, and
Definitely.
we'll give the opportunity to Ken to respond.
Awesome. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Thanks for coming to the Hertie School. My name's Andrew Hastings, MIA student at Hertie. So my question is about the liability of universities who partner with universities in occupied land. For example, the Hertie School has a partnership with Hebrew University, which operates in East Jerusalem. The ICJ has released advisory opinions about this last summer. And so I was curious, under international law, I guess this is open across the board, do you think that German universities are in violation of international law by rendering aid to occupation and annexation? Thank you.
I mean, what the International Court of Justice opinion said, the advisory opinion, was that the endless occupation is illegal, that no government should support the occupation, which means don't sell Israel arms that are used for the occupation, don't provide the financial means for the occupation. I do not think it should mean cut off all educational or cultural ties. I think that equates the people of a country with the government, which is almost always a mistake. And in fact, you want universities, which are centers of independent thought, to flourish every place. And I think that it is to the benefit of the people of occupied Palestine to have regular exchanges between Israeli universities and the Hertie School or your equivalent. So I just don't think that this concept of, don't aid the occupation should extend to cultural, educational, people-to-people exchanges that are distinct from economic or military support of the government.
Thank you. Next hand. There are several here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Eden. I'm a human rights defender and journalist based in Berlin. First of all, I have a comment. I just want to thank you so much for your public support to free Julian Assange before and after you were part of Human Rights Watch. That means a lot to journalists around the world. My second question is, my question to you, Sudan has been facing 30 million people have been forcibly displaced from Sudan. It's called the worst displacement crisis in history. My country, Ethiopia, you said there's an ethnic cleansing going on, that's still going on, has been called the deadliest conflict in the 21st century. And thank you for also mentioning the ongoing violence that's still going on in Goma. So my question to you is the silence on African suffering a symptom of geopolitical apathy, of racism, or a failing media model? I'm asking you as someone who spends so much time on the streets pleading for support, how do I force people to care about these issues? Thank you.
Yeah. That is such a good question. And I completely share your frustration. And I think the answer is all of the above to the things you listed. I mean, the classic view is you have to add several zeros to the numbers before people pay attention when it's in Africa. And sadly, that's true. I mean, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine, it's horrible. But what's happening in Sudan right now in Darfur is really despicable. What happened in Tigray 2 years ago was awful in Ethiopia. What's happening today in Eastern Congo. So, this is a challenge for the human rights movement, is how do you get people to care? And, one thing, for example, with Darfur, an avenue that has found has been productive in a way, although it shouldn't even be required, is to point out that the principal government arming the rapid support forces, the kind of modern day Janjaweed, the government, the entity that had committed genocide 20 years ago and is probably committing it again now. The main arms supplier is the United Arab Emirates, the country where Dubai is, the playground for the world. They're, for partly just to get the gold to go through Dubai, partly for geopolitical competition reasons with Saudi Arabia, they have been arming the rapid support forces. And, it finally, the Biden administration in its last days imposed sanctions on 7 UAE companies. But suddenly, it wasn't quite a Western connection, but it was closer to the West and people cared about it a little bit. How do you get people to care about Eastern Congo? And, it's almost only because Rwanda makes such an effort to become part of the West. You're now trying to say, oh, Trump, you can send us your asylum seekers. What they did with the British government and the prior British government. That creates kind of a more immediate hook. But it shouldn't take that. That's the frustration. It should be that we can say, the people of Eastern Congo are suffering because Paul Kagame is yet again under, taking a brutal invasion. And that's not enough. People just think, oh, that's Africa. So I share your frustration. And this is, a big task before all of us.
Thank you. Next question. And yeah, so over here.
Hello. First of all, again, thank you so much for this panel discussion. It was incredible and very interesting to hear about it. My name is Lisa. I'm a student from Bard College Berlin, and I'm just pursuing the field of human rights and advocacy. And my question is related to kind of new strategies and new ways we can bring governments and people to, respond and take responsibility for their crimes, for the war crimes. I personally come from Ukraine, and when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, I suddenly realized, oh, well, okay, a lot of institutions and a lot of the laws are not being respected at all. And one of the reasons for me to kind of try to pursue this field is to, okay, so I see that, this laws and this organization that we have do not work, so I need to learn how they worked before to understand how to fix them and how to make sure that they would work better. So that is my question, and I think you talked a little bit about it, about the, bringing governments into kind of being responsible in this way and so on. But my question is there any new ways or the ways that have to be explored a little bit more to try to bring the governments into responsibility maybe faster, maybe in a better way? So that would be my question. Thanks.
All right. Not an easy question. The situation of Ukraine, it's complicated today. To take a kind of a glass half full approach, while Putin, is doing in Ukraine what he did in Syria, what he did in Chechnya, which is, just attacking the civilian population. It's, a pure war crime strategy. The good news is that the world has responded. The International Criminal Court has charged, Putin only for the kidnapping of children, but 4 of his military commanders for bombing electrical facilities. The UN Human Rights Council, set up a monitoring mechanism, has condemned him. The General Assembly has condemned him. There's been a lot. Every government in the world is imposing sanctions on him. Ukraine is being armed left and right. So this is an extraordinary response. I wish, Eastern Congo would get this, But today, oddly, the most important factor is the Trump factor. And let's take a moment to talk about Donald Trump. Because, you talk about, we need new approaches. If you, go to Trump and say, you're ignoring human rights in Ukraine, he would say, what are those? So, a frontal approach is not going to work. If you say, you're cozying up to your best buddy, Putin, he would say, yeah, he's great, isn't he? He gets to operate without the checks and balances I wish I could get rid of, So you need a different approach. And I think the best approach here is, and this is, the creative side of shaming. Shaming is not always frontal. It's not always saying, oh, you're violating human rights, Shaming is about what does this government or person care about? And what Trump cares about is his self-image. Trump cares about Trump. And the image he has is of this master negotiator, the art of the deal. And so our best bet with Trump is to get him worried about being seen as naive. And the way this matters is at this point, even though Putin is resisting, it's pretty clear that this conflict is going to end, somewhere along the military front lines. And Trump, his preference is just to say, that's it. We got to, Putin signed. We can trust Putin, right? And in any event, we're going to have American miners on the ground. That's all the security guarantee that Ukraine needs, because who's going to invade if we have miners there, right? And so this is, he tries to be oblivious to the fact that Putin could care less about, a little territory in eastern Ukraine. He wants to snuff out Ukraine's democracy. He wants to go to Kyiv. And you need a security guarantee to prevent Putin from using a ceasefire as an opportunity to replenish his diminished forces, rearm, and reinvade in a few years. And Trump's, oh, he wouldn't do that, Yeah. So this is, the only way to counter that, and Trump really matters here, personally, Trump, is to get him worried about being seen as having been bamboozled by Putin. That if Trump signs off on this ceasefire deal without a US-backed security guarantee provided by European forces, he will emerge as the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century. This will be the guy who didn't see what Putin was really after and basically handed it to him. And so, it's not easy to get through to Trump because he doesn't read. So you've got to get at him, either through Fox News or through the people around him. But that's got to be our strategy. We got to get Trump to sort of recognize the need for a more sophisticated approach. And you could say something similar about Gaza. He is. The good news is that Trump doesn't stand for anything other than himself. So it's not as if he's got a principled commitment to anything. And if we can just, persuade him that his self-interest in promoting his brilliant reputation would be undermined by this naive approach to Ukraine, that's our best bet. And we have to pursue things like that. It's odd that, we're sitting here and playing psychology when things of, these are matters of life and death. But that's what you got to do with Trump.
Thank you. So shaming the shameless somehow. Okay, there's a hand here, Mirko. We've been waiting, sorry.
Yeah, my question was a follow-up to a previous question that was asked. So it is about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where boycott and sanctions have been used effectively to target countries which were complicit in the apartheid. So in follow-up to the question that was asked earlier about cutting ties with universities that are in occupied land, which are also adding up to, which are also helping out with research in in weaponry or military operations as well. So saying, wouldn't it be right to talk about cutting ties, especially in terms where universities which are functioning in occupied land would be aiding the military or aiding the occupation itself? So rather than, should we only be focusing on the government, or should we also be focusing on institutions which function in creating and generating knowledge and also in creating weaponry which is being used for the occupation? So shouldn't we also be talking about that?
Yeah, Human Rights Watch put out a report a few years ago called Occupation Inc. And what we looked at was a series of companies that do business in the occupied West Bank. And we basically argued that they should cut their ties because they were providing economic support for the occupation. So we didn't limit ourselves, just to the military. We were willing to look at the, the economic angle as well. And I suppose you can make the case that, a university is providing some economic benefit, but I'm very reluctant to cut off ties to other universities because I think that local opposition to repression in whatever form is usually the most powerful. And universities as centers of independent thought are often where that local opposition starts. And we shouldn't be treating the students or the faculty of universities as the enemies just because they're in Russia or they're in occupied West Bank or they're in China or wherever it is. We should look at these people as potential allies because change doesn't happen just externally. Change happens principally from internal actors. And I just think it's a mistake to start ostracizing universities, pushing them into the camp of the occupier, rather than treating them as potential allies who can join with you in opposing the occupation.
Thank you. We had a question here for a long time, and then I'll be back to the other side.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Kai Sauer. I'm the Finnish ambassador to Germany, and I thank you for the talk and congratulate you for attracting such a crowd on the Friday evening. I guess
it just speaks to how little there's to do in Berlin.
Human rights have some hope at all. But I also served as a UN ambassador when Ken, you were active with human rights, and I liked how you always pushed the UN Secretary General to be more general than secretary, and I think he didn't like it that much.
It depends which one.
And now we see that principal intergovernmental organization which is supposed to promote human rights, it's at a very low point. What would be your message to the current SG and the incoming SG? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Kai, as you know very well, there are basically two United Nations. There's the United Nations that is operational, that is headed by individuals, like the Secretary General or the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And here it really is the character and the principles of the individual that matter. There's also the UN, which is essentially a conference room. They rent out a conference room to the governments of the world to make decisions. The UN is a conference room. It depends which conference room we're talking about. And so these days the UN Security Council is worthless because everybody's using the veto so much that it's very difficult to get things done. The UN General Assembly, where there is no veto, gets things done occasionally, but since all 193 members are there, it's hard to lobby. And so the principal institution, the principal conference room, is the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva with, 47 members. And we get a lot done there. I mean, just, in recent, the last year or two, Syria, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Myanmar, Iran, Sudan. I mean, it's like every major situation, Gaza, it's acting. It has investigators, reports, condemnations, collecting evidence for prosecution. Now, none of this necessarily stops it like that, but these are the tools, as I explained in the book, that over time can make a difference. So that UN is still a very important forum. Now, when it comes to individuals, it depends on the individual. And I'm very laudatory of Kofi Annan, for example, who was wonderful, who was incredibly principled, who had this gravitas and, was able to not only be heard, but have people pay attention to him. Even Ban Ki-moon, who was, much more timid, but I describe how we got him to act, for example, on LGBT rights, which was very hard for him to do as a South Korean, a very conservative society, but he did, and it made a huge difference. I am critical of Antonio Guterres or his counterpart, Volker Turk, now the UN High Commissioner, mainly because of their utter cowardice on China. And, as I explain in the book, I actually think China today poses the greatest threat to the global human rights system because it's the only government that is actually trying to rewrite the rules and change the standards, stop the pressure, just have nice, pleasant chit-chat about how everybody's finding their own way to respect human rights, which means, nothing. But when it comes to the most intense form of repression that the Chinese government is engaged in, which is its persecution of the Uyghurs, and having locked up 1 million Uyghurs to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, their language, today forcing Uyghurs into forced labor. Volker Turk has not once in his 2.5 years condemned China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. Guterres, when Turk's predecessor, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president who was High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time, put out a very powerful report finding possible crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs, Guterres said, read the Chinese response. Michelle, she's just an independent person. She doesn't represent the UN. He was awful. And so you've got, the Secretary General, the High Commissioner, who have utterly failed on the worst abuse by the greatest threat to the human rights system. An utter abdication, total cowardice. And when that's what you got, the personnel side of the UN is in pretty bad shape. They can criticize, less complicated situations, but when it comes to a real challenge, something that requires a bit of a backbone, they don't have it.
Thank you for that.
It's all in the book, yes. Yeah, by the way, I should say that, the book, it's available online. Ask the local bookstore, they can get it for you. But, by all means, I encourage you to purchase it.
In the book, you also explained that Bachelet actually issued this report like half an hour before the end of her mandate.
You're being generous. 13 minutes before the end of her mandate, yes.
Right, okay, I mixed it up. Okay, there was a hand here, and then another one there, and another one there. Please.
Should I start first?
Yeah.
Or?
Go.
Okay. Mirko Đuković, postdoctoral researcher at Center for Fundamental Rights. I see some of my students are here. In this semester, I was teaching emerging technologies and human rights. So in that sense, I want to ask something and maybe bring back to the first original question about the future of human rights. So there are two things that I agreed with my students in this semester. The first thing is that in the age of algorithms, we are now experiencing suppression of thought. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we arrived at this point with the authoritarian regimes, with the rise of new technologies, when we agreed to, when liberals agreed to discuss facts, to prove facts all over and over again. So combining these two things that I learned from my students in this semester, my question to you is, what current human rights are in danger the most with the rise of new technologies? Thank you.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot in that question, and obviously, whenever you have an algorithm, it's susceptible to manipulation, and it's hard to know what that manipulation is because it's hidden in the software. But what I'm finding people, and I think this is essential in your question, does the emergence of AI, bots, social media, does that put us in a post-truth world? And that's a fair question, because it used to be, if you're the Kremlin and you want to put out your propaganda, yes, Pravda would publish you, but ordinarily you would have to deal with, journalists and editors at a handful of mainstream media outlets who, for the most part, were conscientious about seeking the truth, and they would see that you're putting out a bunch of crap, just propaganda. We're not in that world anymore. One, there's been a proliferation of media, so you'll always find somebody who prints what you put out. And second, with social media, you can spread whatever you want. And a lot of people just look at their social media feed and whatever pops up at the top, whether it's Elon Musk's latest musings or, the latest AI output by some bot, they'll believe it. So that's the challenge. It's a much more difficult world. I personally don't think that we're in a post-truth world because, many people, including I think probably everybody in this audience, seeks the truth. Not everybody does. Some people just read whatever shows up in social media, but many people seek the truth, and you can find it by looking to reputable institutions. That's the role that Human Rights Watch tried to play. That's the role that, major newspapers, major media outlets play. So you know where to look. For me, kind of perhaps the most surprising, but the best evidence of the power of truth, I'm going to cite two unusual authorities for this proposition: Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Now, why do I say this? Because each of them oversees a huge propaganda machine. So each, has AI and bots coming out the kazoo. They don't just rely on propaganda. Despite those massive resources for propaganda, they still censor. They still realize the truth is dangerous, and they want to prevent their people from gaining access to it. They want to prevent their people from speaking the truth. And so I think we should look to the authorities here. And if they don't trust mere propaganda to suppress the truth, we shouldn't get all despairing. Truth remains powerful, and truth is significant because truth is how we hold leaders accountable.
Thank you. There was a hand for a long time here. Nicolas.
Hi, I'm Nicolas, a student of the MIA program. Thank you for being here today also. So my question is, if you have a word in situations when we don't have the tools of international system or the human rights system and countries isolate themselves. I'm thinking in the case of Venezuela, that they withdraw from the American human rights system in 2001 and also from OAS. And despite many condemnations of the International Court and sanctions and the white protest everywhere, Maduro is still in power. We have 7 million of refugees around the continent. And there is a few peaceful ways to still pressure the regime. So what word do you have to those incredible Venezuelans that still believe in a peaceful solution without arms? And for the others, Latin American countries that also support, and we have like a very narrow interpretation of the non-intervention principle, so we don't want any armed conflict in the region. So which tools do we have, or what do you say to this
Yeah. I mean, Venezuela is a very difficult case because obviously there's been broad condemnation, there have been sanctions, and Maduro is just, he's one of these people who's willing to cling to power even at the expense of destroying his country. And that's what he's done. I mean, Venezuela was a relatively wealthy country, and now it's in destitution. And as you mentioned, it has as many refugees at this stage as I think Syria has. So it's an awful situation. And I mean, in recent, say the last year, the West has been a bit inconsistent. They started allowing Venezuela to pump oil, really because they were trying to replace Russian oil, but on the basis of promises from Maduro that he didn't keep. And when he, allowed a fake election to go forward and pretended to have won it, they said, whatever, and they just kept the oil flowing. Now, that's beginning to change under Trump. I mean, Trump's being a little bit tougher, but even Trump is mainly concerned about the price of a tank of gas. He wants to show that inflation is down, and so he's willing to push that rather than the freedom for the Venezuelan people. But I think that the key is, first of all, a sustained, combined Latin American response. This should not just be a Washington thing. It should be, continuing what the Lima Group was doing for a while, this group of Latin American democracies. That's a form of peer pressure that is much more effective than pressure from Washington. I think the other useful thing it's always useful in any autocratic situation is to try to spotlight, what the autocrat is doing, because there are always people in the country who are benefiting from the autocrat. In the case of Maduro, it's the military, it's the people he's paying off. And the more you can spotlight how Maduro is, taking what riches remain in Venezuela and basically divvying them up among just a handful of his cronies to sustain power, the more you hasten the view, even among the handful of people who saw themselves as old-time Chavistas, to recognize that this guy's a disaster and we got to get rid of him. So I don't think it's a military invasion from outside. It's a matter of more sustained pressure and really working to build opposition within the country to get rid of this guy who is clearly a total disaster for the country.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. Of course, there are so many hands. Sorry, they will be here.
Hi, my name is Kai. I'm a former student of Bard College Berlin. So I want to ask about, specifically also because Catherine, you're here, about journalists and also about the breaking apart of the international human rights law order, specifically by Israel and Gaza, and most of the EU and West as a whole being completely complicit in it, arming, and then yet standing by and not saying anything. Within it, we have, the largest amount of journalists killed in any conflict, I believe, going back further than World War II. It's horrible. 217 journalists killed as of this morning, with several more having been killed overnight. Yesterday, one was targeted in his hospital bed. At the same point, we have, Western media and Western governments don't seem to be standing up for journalists, who are the ones who yell out when human rights violations are happening. At the same time, Israel just given more weapons. Is eroding all the trust in this. I read reports about 2 years ago when it first started from the State Department, where they were saying when they talk about Ukraine to other countries, they're told, look at Gaza, you guys don't really care about it, right? And I think we all kind of know to a certain amount the West has not actually cared about human rights forever. It's only a kind of facade, I really think. We've been willing to let them go whenever we feel like it. Congo is a great example. All of our phones are being fueled with the blood of Congolese children. We know that, and yet most of our governments stand by the side. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what do you think the danger of this is, this erosion of protection of journalists and the allowing of just complete erosion of human rights as a standard being protected, and then yet Western governments just arming it, continuing to arm and defend Israel to the fullest, with Merz even saying, if Netanyahu comes, it's fine. It's ridiculous, and it should be a shame to all of us. It's a little bit of a big topic there, but I think it's really important, specifically the carnage that's happening. Yeah, thank you.
A good question. So let me try to answer with 3 parts. I mean, one, the attack on journalists. I mean, there clearly is an effort, to just hide what Israel is doing. And if it's sight unseen, then maybe there wouldn't be as much opposition. Now, fortunately, that hasn't worked. And people, despite great risk, continue to document what's going on, so we know what's going on. So it's a failed strategy, but it's a very deadly strategy. You're absolutely right about the West's double standard, and so we have to call that out. I wouldn't be kind of go to the next step and say, oh, therefore, international human rights standards are dead. Because in fact, there has been broad condemnation of what's going on. There's been a reaffirmation of those standards. That's what South Africa's case against Israel for genocide is. That's what the International Criminal Court charges are. That's what the repeated condemnations by the UN Human Rights Council are. That's what the many, many statements by individual governments are. So there has been plenty of reaffirmation of humanitarian law. Israel is flouting it. They're getting away with it because really just a handful of governments, principally the US and Germany and to some extent Britain, are backing it. But most governments are not. So we shouldn't be dire from that perspective, even though the consequences for the Palestinian people are devastating. I'd like to conclude by bringing up an analogy that is, I think, useful for how we might move to the next stage. And the analogy is a person, I'm not sure a name is even going to be meaningful to you, but I describe the person in the book. His name is Charles Taylor. Is that a meaningful name? No. Okay, Charles Taylor was the former president of Liberia. Now, what does Liberia have to do with Gaza? Charles Taylor was selling arms to a rebel force in neighboring Sierra Leone called the Revolutionary United Front. They would mine diamonds, give him diamonds. He would give them arms. They would use the arms to commit atrocities, mainly chopping off people's limbs. An awful group. Charles Taylor was prosecuted by an international tribunal, convicted of aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity, and is currently serving a 50-year prison term in a British prison. And we need to use that as a precedent, that when you arm a government that is committing systematic atrocities, you are aiding and abetting those atrocities. You are a criminal too. And, it's a difficult moment for the International Criminal Court because suddenly it's headless. But if it were to pursue a theory like that, people would wake up. And, it doesn't mean that Trump is in handcuffs tomorrow, but it does mean that suddenly there are 125 governments where he would not really be welcomed by, and the world looks a lot smaller. You could say, well, Putin, he's still sitting there in the Kremlin, he's doing fine, but, he couldn't go to the Pope's funeral. He couldn't go to the BRICS summit in South Africa. He can't go to Brazil. The world is smaller. So that's something, and I think that if we were to really move toward taking the idea of aiding and abetting mass atrocities seriously, we could take a significant step towards stopping this, blind arming of the Israeli government, regardless of what it does with these weapons.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask for a round of applause to thank the speakers. Thank you very much to you for coming on a Friday evening, to Ken for honoring us and the talk on the book, to all the experts in the panel. We have some drinks and food served outside, so please join informally the panel if you wish, right outside for refreshments. Thank you very much.